right, 17 part 2. I'm trying to get through this pretty quickly. All right, for mining was the first thing that really brought a lot of people out to the West. The Bonanza West, getting rich quick, led to uneven growth, kind of boom and bust economic cycles. People move in with the rivers, gold strikes, railroad tracks, instant cities like San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Denver, and institutions of large deposits of rich minerals, precious metals. People would come in, and then constant change where they might strike it rich and go, and then might leave it and basically create ghost towns later on. Mining will move west to east. A lot of people are moving that surface gold. Finding pockets that remove the surface. It doesn't take a whole lot of money or skill or equipment, yet you get a lot of profit. Big corporations would come in with the heavy equipment later, especially for quartz. Needed heavy machinery, and the corporations come in. They discovered the Comstock lode in Nevada and produced over $306 million in gold and silver from 1859 to 1879. Black Hills Gold Rush will overrun the Sioux hunting ground. Final fling later on, gold all over the hills. Calamity Jane, Wild Bill Hickok, miners traveling from strike to strike, hoping to gain riches. Custer discovered gold in Dakotas, inspired the last wave of miners. All right, so the use of mining camps, most were men, outnumbered women 2-to-1. A lot of people were actually foreign born as well. California actually had a foreign miners tax, $20 a month fee, rights against the Chinese. Federal Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 excluded Chinese immigration for 10 years. You do have some women as cooks, housekeepers, seamstresses, but respectable women were kind of rare to come by in mining towns. The West was ideal for cattle as well. Some of the effects as well. Millions to the economy, help finance the Civil War, industrialization, relative value of silver and gold change, increased silver supplies. Early statehood for Nevada, Idaho, Montana, Western Territories achieved statehoods because of the increased population and invaded Indian reservations, polluted the environment, and created ghost towns because of the boom and bust cycles with the mining towns. All right, cattle was one of the big things. Far West was ideal. Ranchers realized the potential. Cattle would thrive on the prairie grass. Ranchers quickly prosper from it. The open range, Texas Panhandle to Canada. Open range ranching was the norm from 1865 to 1885. You have the vaqueros, the cattle drives. People would take their cattle to places like Abilene, Kansas, or Dodge City, and then they would take the railroad up to Chicago markets where the meat would be processed. Barbed wire allowed ranchers and farmers to fence land cheaply. Later, we'll kind of start to cut down on the cattle drives. And I'm going to pause this and come back because class started. But cattle, for the cattle bonanza, Far West was ideal for cattle grazing. The ranchers kind of realized this potential. The open range was the Texas Panhandle to Canada. And the cattle will be taken in herds, the railheads meeting in Abilene, Kansas, Dodge City. They would lead them to the Chicago markets and processed from Chicago and then be distributed from there. Barbed wire allowed ranchers and farmers to fence land pretty cheap. Profits were huge for the large ranchers. Risk on the cattle drives, weather, wildlife, but cowboys would work long hours for little pay, about $125 a month. About half the cowboys were either African American or Mexican. Very few opportunities for advancement for cowboys. Cattle towns were usually pretty safe and peaceful with very strictly enforced rules. Cowboys were pretty much a self-governing group. Rules before going on the trail: shooting at the cowboy equals being hanged on the spot. All right. The only thing I was going to mention on this one was farming population tripling on the plains from Dakota to Texas, several years of above average rainfall. The African American exoduster farmers migrating from the south to escape racism still face prejudice, but not nearly as extreme. Exodusters are former slaves moving to Kansas and homesteading about 20,000 acres. Total were used up. Water, building materials were pretty scarce. Wells were 50 to 500 feet deep and very little surface water. Sod houses, like in the picture, were the most common house or first dwelling. And it was 3 feet sections laid like brick. It cost you about $2.78 to build. And water would leak in when it rained, couldn't keep it clean. Life was very hard, but it was necessary for survival. All right, discontent on the farm. They began fencing The range, wheat farmers begin fencing, so the era of the cattle drive starts to come to an end. Open range ends early 1900s. Very bitter disputes between the cattle and the ranchers and the sheep ranchers. Ranching becomes more controlled, more profitable, but far less romantic. The idea of just living off the land. The mechanization, modernizing ranching, slaughtering, transportation, cold storage. We'll get into the whole refrigerated rail cars and everything later on. Harsh winter in 1886 kills tens of thousands. They found them in stacks piled on fences, frozen together. And so the ranchers start to reduce their herds. Some of them switch to sheep, just from the experience of it all. New farming methods, the barbed wire. Barbed wire was allows fencing without having to do a wooden fence, because that would cost you about $1,000 to fence in 160 acres. Dry farming was a new technique. Deeper tilling of the land. They used mulch, which meant slower evaporation to compensate for the lack of rainfall. Newer strains of wheat that were more resilient and resistant to frost were developed and imported. Drought starts to kind of ruin some of the larger farms and begin to struggle. Small-scale farms and diversifying farming is going to help. California, you have fruit, wine, and wheat. Texas with beef, and Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, Colorado area sticks with wheat. Farmers that were discontent were unhappy with the drabness of farm life. Social, cultural, educational activities for farm families, part of this. The declining crop prices, raising railroad rates, heavy mortgages, and so they create the Grange, which was like a political lobby group for their all the things that they weren't happy with. The final fling was Oklahoma, opened to white settlement, 1889. President Harrison opened the last territory. Oklahoma land rush started April 22nd, 1889 at noon. Almost 2 million acres were claimed by sunset, forced out the Creek and Seminole, and people lined the Oklahoma borders. There was a whole boomer sooner idea, and basically you run and you start at the starting line and you go and claim your land. Changing views of the far west, you have the frontier thesis. Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, the significance of the frontier in the American history, basically saying exploration and westward settlement shapes American culture and development, and the West was the first American empire as he sees it. And that's it. That's all for the unit.